Falcons Flight at Six Flags Qiddiya City in Saudi Arabia has officially opened as the world's tallest, fastest, and longest roller coaster, making that cartoonish-like animation that came out years ago actually a reality. You can't deny that the ride is absolutely impressive, even if it looks like it may not be the most forceful coaster ever created, but so far the reviews of it seem pretty glowing. Now in this video, I won't be diving much into the ride experience itself, but much more into the technical side of it. So we're talking what makes this ride work, its block zones, and something that I think could be a major issue with the ride. So if you do want to learn more about the experience itself of Falcons Flight in Six Flags Qiddiya City, you'll definitely want to tune in to my friends Taylor and Sarah at Coaster Studios, as well as many of the other channels who graciously allowed me to use their content for this video. Now with that said, let's dive into my third analysis video on Falcons Flight, where we'll talk more about how the coaster functions, as well as what I think could be a major issue with Falcons Flight going forward. If you guys enjoy this video as it plays, I kindly ask for your support by clicking the like button, as that helps the channel greatly against the YouTube algorithm. Alright, let's get into it. So before we go more into what I think is the major issue with the ride, there has been an interesting change with the trains. So along with the windshields at the front of each car, there's also an arrow wing that sits behind each row of seats. In videos from the ride's opening weekend, you can see that wing really shaking around, especially during the ride's fastest moments. Well, I guess those arrow wings were shaking much more than desired, and efforts are already in place to make them stiffer. In this video, we can see the addition of cross bracing between the two supports at the middle of the wing. Now this cross bracing is simply cables that they added that connect to the bolts on these two supports, and it's hard to tell in this video, but perhaps it has strengthened the arrow wings. Now this video also shows some even crazier stuff about the ride, and that's a rollback following the ride's second launch, where it launches trains to 100 miles per hour, and the train then ascends to its highest moment of about 607 feet at the top of this fan curve. Now also just another quick thing to say about the ride, while the change in elevation is 640 feet, Falcons Flight is technically not 640 feet tall. That 640 foot height elevation is the difference between the 607 foot tall fan curve and I believe this turn here under the bridge into the park's front entrance, which is the coaster's lowest moment. But either way, the ride is still absurdly tall, and the 535 foot tall freestanding camelback is just ridiculous. But anyway, in this video, we see the train rolling back following that second launch as it fails to clear the 607 foot tall fan curve. And this is cool for so many reasons. One is that you may get a chance at getting a rollback on this ride, and based on the speeds that trains travel over the fan curve versus the camelback, it seems to be more likely that you'll get a rollback here as opposed to the camelback. And I've also seen a separate video where the train rolls back on the fan curve also. Now it has been colder in Saudi Arabia lately, especially at night when the park opens, so that could be a contributing factor as to why we're seeing more rollbacks. The linear synchronous motors, or LSMs, of the second launch slow the train as it descends back down the hill, and once the train is stopped at the base of the hill, it's slowly moved all the way back to the start of launch 2. And they even have pre-recorded announcements that go with the ride's theme about rollbacks and how they're normal. And they even do so in different languages. So this was totally accounted for, which is pretty cool. Now one of the coolest things about this is that the train is relaunched with riders still on board. So even as absurd as this launch is, at 100 miles per hour uphill, it seems like the operational norm is just to relaunch the train fully loaded. And this is totally the way it should be, especially since riders at this point are so far away from the actual station, since this ride is just so massive. And it's great to see this on a ride of this caliber, especially compared to something like the Flash Vertical Velocity at Six Flags Great Adventure, where when that ride valleys over a launch, all riders have to first be evacuated and then the train can be relaunched. The tactic here with Falcons Flight is much superior and will help to keep the ride operating more often, as rollbacks will certainly continue to be a thing. Something else that's great about this rollback video is that it gives more evidence about the ride's block zones. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a block zone is a section of ride that only one train may occupy. At the end of a block zone is a method to stop a train in case the block zone ahead is still occupied. This is the safety system that prevents roller coaster trains from colliding into one another. In my 2 prior analysis videos, I've been guessing at what the ride's block zones could be, and we have that diagram here. So just a little recap, starting with the first launch, I had that as the launch 1 block, and that ends at the crest of the launch lift hill, which then leads to the launch 2 block, which consists of the first section of ride with the beginning airtime hills, as well as launch number 2 up until the top of the fan curve, and then following the top of the fan curve became the launch 3 block. And this rollback video is further evidence that this green section, or the launch 2 block, is as I guessed it. Now something I'd been wondering is if this flat section of track here at the base of launch 2 would be split into 2 blocks, where the initial section of straight track could act as a brake run and stop a train, and then the second half of straight track could be a second block. This rollback video confirms that there are only tire drives at the very beginning of the straight track, and these tire drives act as the control point that technically fully stop the train, as they're what makes physical contact with the train where the LSM stators do not. We also see that since the train is reversed all the way to these tire drives, the ride utilizes this full section of straight track as part of launch 2. So the launch would not work if you had 2 trains stopped in this section. The train needs to be reversed all the way so that it can use all of the provided LSMs, which is definitely great evidence that this green line is as it is, and that this is the launch 2 block. Now I did see a few questions as to why the end of the launch 2 block is at the top of the cliff wall instead of the launch itself. And that's actually a great question, and it goes back to my block zone definition, as the definition best applies to lift hills and brake runs, but not really launches. Launches are actually a bit different, and if you look at some of my other videos with launching coasters, you'll start to notice some similarities between the launches. Usually that block will not end with the launch itself, but with the high point following the launch. Using Falcon's flight as an example, the launch 3 block has to be unoccupied in order for launch 2 to engage. So if the launch 3 block is still occupied and a train rolls up to launch 2 will simply not engage and stop the train instead. But the block zone ends at the high point following the launch, as that's where gravity takes back over and sends the train through the rest of the layout. And the only thing capable of sending the train up and over that high point is the launch in that block zone. I hope that explains things a little better, but let me know if you'd like to see a full video about this instead. Going back to the launch 2 block, we actually have to extend it just slightly into the launch 3 block. In these new videos of Falcon's flight, it looks like a proximity sensor that flags when a train has exited the launch 2 block is at this location here. This is very nerdy, but I originally placed the end of the launch 2 block higher up on the fan curve, basically right where the train has crested the fan curve and then continues on its own. Now even though the cliff wall is beneath this section of track, it would place the proximity sensors higher in the air, whereas the actual placement of them places them right at ground level, making them very easy to access for maintenance or replacing them. So I'll go to my diagram and move the launch 2 block just slightly into the launch 3 block. Moving on to the launch 3 block, we also have some great video provided in this reverse POV filmed by Coaster Studios. And something I had been wondering is if we would see hardware present at the top of the camelback to indicate that that was the end of a block zone, and that there would be some sort of coasting block following the launch 3 block. And in this video, it looks like we see proximity sensors right at the crest of the hill, which would flag when a train has exited the launch 3 block and now entered what I'm calling the service brake block. And this was something I was hoping for, as the ride's capacity would just be completely stunted if the launch 3 block could not be separated from the coasting block. We already saw in my prior analysis video on Falcon's flight that launch 3 is more than capable of taking an empty train at a standstill, and with a swing launch sending it up and over that camelback with no problem. And now that we see when trains roll back in launch 2 with riders and are simply relaunched, I think that's further evidence that that same operational practice would go to launch 3. And if a train were to roll back on launch 3, that train loaded with riders would execute a swing launch so that it can continue through the circuit. And if that's the case, that's probably the ride you want on Falcon's flight. The additional launches to get your stopped train back up and over the camelback are probably insane. But yeah, going back to these sensors at the top of the camelback, it's great to see them here, and I think that this is great evidence that the launch 3 block and service brake block are separate from each other. Something else we see in these videos is that I have to move around my station blocks a bit. Falcon's flight of course features a dual track station, and within each of the parallel tracks are 3 block zones. At the front of the station is the load station, and riders board from the middle of the station. But I originally thought the second zone in the middle would be the unload station, but it turns out the first zone is actually the unload station, and the middle zone is just a waiting block. So I have to flip around the station zones, so we now have unload as the first zone, and waiting as the middle zone. Now going forward from here, here, this is where I want to talk about the problem I see with Falcons Flight, and that all has to do with its rider capacity. And from what I can tell, it seems like the ride will unfortunately have pretty awful capacity. Taking a look at the final brake run, I was hoping that there would be some method in place to split this into 2 blocks, where we'd have a final brake run like on Velocicoaster at Islands of Adventure, which is also an Intamin roller coaster, and it features a mid-course like brake run built into the final brake run. The first section of brake run can either fully stop a train if needed, or if the next block is unoccupied, it will slow the train to a quick jog, allowing that train to quickly exit that block, which allows the next approaching train to more quickly execute launch 2. It brings the gaps between the trains smaller and allows for a higher rider capacity. And it's how Velocicoaster achieves well over 5 million riders a year. But that's not what was built into Falcons Flight. Falcons Flight instead has a much more traditional brake run, where a magnetic brake system brings the train to a very controlled speed. So once the train is slowed to the speed, the brake fins drop and the train cruises forward, where we finally see a first drive tire, which makes physical contact with the train, and then there are many more drive tires following. We also see just one section of catwalk where the train is meant to park, which is just further evidence that this section is only 1 block. If we were to see something like Velocicoaster's brake run, in this first section of brake run where the train actually slows down, you would probably want to see a much greater amount of retractable brake fins, as well as a large cluster of drive tires to act as that control point at the end of that block. But that's just simply not the case here. So this means Falcons Flight's final brake run is just 1 block, and that trains have to exit this very long section of brake run in order for the next train to execute launch 3 and send that train up and over the camelback. Now I estimate that it takes about 75 seconds with a fully loaded train from when it clears the sensor at the top of the camelback, indicating that the train is now in the service brake block, until when that train actually exits the service brake block and enters one of the 2 unload blocks. A 75-second interval time is 48 trains per hour, and with the ride's 14 passenger trains, that's just 672 riders per hour. But that's just the start of the story, since the 75 seconds begins at the top of the camelback and not at the beginning of launch 3, it doesn't give us the full picture. So we have to extend that time frame to account for launch 3, as well as some buffer time so that it's not so close of a window that trains constantly have to stop in launch 3 because the train ahead is still exiting the service brake block. So if I take the time from when the train exits the hold brake at the top of the cliff drop, which is ahead of launch 3 at the base of that drop, to when the train exits the service brake block, I get about 90 seconds. At a 90-second interval, that's 40 trains an hour, and at 14 riders per train, that's just 560 riders per hour. Now this 90-second interval works well with a fully loaded train, as that still gives several seconds of buffer between when a train exits the service brake block to when the next train would enter launch 3, but it does not account for empty trains which take longer to ride through the circuit. Getting even more nerdy, it takes roughly 51 seconds for a fully loaded train from when it exits launch 3 to when it exits that last turn into the final brake run, and then 56 seconds for an empty train to navigate this same section of track. So just a 5-second difference, which isn't that much, but the empty train slows to a crawl so much earlier on the final brake run. Surprisingly, it's similar to much older Intamin coasters like Top Thrill Dragster or Millennium Forest at Cedar Point, where the brake run behaves so much better for a fully loaded train. And fully loaded trains slow to a controlled speed right before that catwalk at the end of the brake run, whereas empty trains slow to a crawl well before that catwalk. And since the train is still so far up the brake run, it's still riding through fixed magnetic brakes, leaving the train just crawling through the brake run. Now the POV with the empty train cuts off after about 10 seconds, but that's 10 seconds of crawling with the train still nowhere near the end of the block. So I really can't say what the minimum interval of the ride is, but hopefully it's accounting for a fully loaded train, as that can still give you something as low as a 90-second interval with 560 riders per hour. But if the interval is based off an empty train, that's probably closer to a 2-minute interval. So at a 120-second interval, we're looking at just 30 dispatches an hour, which is great for a ride with big massive trains, but with just 14 riders per train, that's only 420 riders per hour. Now even if it's the case that it's 560 riders per hour with a 90-second interval, that's still awful. The whole reason this ride was built was to attract people to Cadia City, as Saudi Arabia looks to make this new city a tourist destination. From what I understand, Falcons Flight may already be more popular than planners were anticipating it, and compared to all the other attractions at the park, Falcons Flight has easily been attracting the largest queues. Now granted, part of that does have to do with the fact that Falcons Flight is only operating at a limited capacity at the moment. The ride is meant to operate with a max of 6 trains on the track, and from what I understand, there are only 3 trains present. And apparently the length of the queue so far has greatly exceeded its advertised length, with it taking well over 2 hours to get on the coaster, even with a posted wait time of under 1 hour. So if the ride will continue to pull the crowds it will, 560 riders per hour really does not seem like enough, and if it's even lower than that, then that's just not okay. Now if operations allowed, I don't think it's out of the picture for that mid-course like brake run found on Velocicoaster to still be added to Falcons Flight later down the road if needed. The brake run is very long and also not completely filled with brake fins, as there are many gaps between the sections of brake fins. Perhaps they could bring trains to a controlled speed sooner, and then add that mid-course like brake feature, and then split the brake run into 2 separate blocks, which would allow trains to cycle much closer together, bringing the ride's capacity much higher. However, there is something else that could be limiting the ride from getting any better than, say, a 90-second interval time. And that's because trains allegedly have to spend 4 minutes in the station. This is so the cooling system built into all 3 platforms on both sides of the station are able to cool the wheels enough so that the train is allowed to cycle the track again. Each train spends about 60 seconds or more traveling in excess of 100 miles per hour. And that's from when the train drops down the cliff to when it hits the final brake run. And that's a longer duration of time than most roller coasters. Pantherion at King's Dominion, which also has issues keeping its wheels cool, takes just over 40 seconds from when a train heads down the first drop to when it enters the final brake run. Now Falcons Flight features much larger road wheels than Pantherion, and maybe the 4-minute time currently is a bit more conservative, and over time maybe that'll be lessened. Now I believe the 4 minutes of time starts when the train parks in the unload station and ends when the train would dispatch from the load station, so it does at least encompass unloading and loading each train, but it still adds a lot of time. Like I was saying with 3 train operations, I believe this does become the holdup, even when using both sides of the platform, as 4 minutes is a lot of time for these trains to unload and load riders. It's probably a very quick unloading and loading process, especially since the trains have a flat level floor that's completely flush with the station platforms, and the seats have no seatbelts, so they should be very easy to check. So currently with just 3 trains in operation, I'd guess that with each dispatch, the ride crew is just waiting for the 4-minute timer to end for each train. But hopefully with 6 trains on the track, this becomes much less of a holdup, as the ride's poor capacity really can't take any more hits. As time goes on and I see more videos of Falcons Flight, hopefully in operation with more trains on the track, maybe I'll revisit the subject to see if the 4-minute station time is truly a holdup with 6 trains on the track. On the contrary, something that may be a good thing is I hear that they may allegedly be looking to remove some of the trim brakes on the large camelback. Falcons Flight currently features a large amount of trim brakes as trains ascend this hill, which is absurd as the hill is 535 feet tall, but I guess a 155 mile per hour launch is simply overkill even for that height. But yeah, from what I've heard, they may actually look to remove some of these trims. Now I must preface that if this is true, I have no idea how many trims they'd actually remove. And there's also the possibility that the trims could be moved to this speed hill here, as the hill already has brackets installed for trim brakes to be placed, but ideally these trims would just be moved to the final brake run. If they were to just remove brake fins from the camelback and then place them on the final brake run, that would be ideal for so many reasons, as not only would it increase the ridiculous sensation of speed through this half of the coaster, but the ride forces would also become slightly more intense. It would also reduce the amount of time it takes for trains to navigate this longest section of ride, and maybe even increase the ride's operational capacity. But again, I can't confirm if trims will actually be removed from the camelback, and if they are removed, they could be added to the speed hill here. So only time will tell, but I'll definitely have my eyes peeled to see if anything changes. So I think with that, that's going to conclude this analysis video on Falcons Flight. Overall, the ride looks absolutely impressive, but I am very concerned about its rider capacity, as even with my guessed theoretical at 560 riders per hour, that means the actual operating capacity would be even lower than that. And if the ride continues to be as popular as it is, it's going to be very frustrating to get on Falcons Flight, especially for the group of people who are traveling around the world to go ride it. So I really hope improvements can be made there. Or even better, I'd love to be wrong about this, but unfortunately I'm just not seeing that. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and hopefully it taught you something new. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more nerdy content just like this. Definitely leave a comment below about what you think about the operational situation at Falcons Flight. With that, thank you everyone for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.